As we wrap up Africa Month tonight, we take a look at regional economic integration on the continent. We unpack efforts made by all community blocs towards integration and economic collaboration. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Aldrin St-Pierre. Key to this discussion is the Free Trade Area, Free Movement Protocol, and the impact of the legacy of the colonial borders integration. Let's welcome our economic consultant, Dr. Peter Karungu, who is joining us this evening. We also have independent political analyst Asanda Nkwasheng, as well as advocate Sipho Mandula, who's joining us as a Pan-African analyst. Remember that you can be part of the conversation using the Twitter handle at Unfiltered SABC, as well as Facebook that you can search for Unfiltered SABC. Good evening. Thank you so much for making time for us. Advocate Mandula, let me start off with you. What does it mean to be an African during a time when we are saying that Africa is no longer colonized, but what does true independence really mean when there's a lot of dependence on Western countries for the economy of our continent?
Jambo Africa, Aldrin, and to your viewers, good evening, Dumelang. Aldrin, I think the issue of what does it mean for us as the continent, it is important to always reflect during this month. What happened 59 years ago, it was a culmination of what happened in 1958, when we had only 8 countries which were independent. Come 1963, there were 32. Come 2002, there were more than 52. And I think economic dependence to the West has been scripted from the Berlin Conference. I will assume that if we have to look at Africa, how it was colonized, the Berlin Conference becomes the point of departure. Mm-hmm. But post-1963, post-1994, post-2002, I think many African countries are making efforts not to rely on the West. We've got competent African farmers and growers now. We've got business community. Despite that, we have the 6th region, by the way, African diaspora, which we have to tap into. So I will assume that for us to say we are still dependent on the West and that we still have to pose the question of liberation. I think the question of the liberation of Africa, it's in 3 fronts now. It must be political, economical, and cultural.
Yeah. Dr. Karungu, do you agree with that, considering that if we look at exports as well as international trade between the various countries on the continent, that there seems to be, seemingly based on the data at least, a reliance on Western countries, and sometimes this time I think it has now also turned to Asia?
Right, so and correct. Mm-hmm. And the issue is, in my view, what do we anticipate in the event we embrace the African continent of free trade? 2 things. 1, free trade has 2 critical elements that everybody needs to understand. First, it allows countries to trade, and in the process of trading, countries are, by geographical dispensation and technological know-how, will have to produce that which they know better, because the alternative will come from the other side. Mm-hmm. Now, second, it gives us the strength of negotiating with power. We're saying we have 1.3 billion plus people who literally will be consuming at minimum, no matter how poor we are. 1. 2, by the standard we know, we are saying there will be close to 3.4 trillion in about 2020, 2021 of trade among African countries, if it were to happen. 3, it will lower each country deficit, trade deficit, by whoever, by more than 50%. 4, it is anticipated by 2030, the African continent will be able to have 6.7 trillion in investment space and in consumption space. That alone says a lot. In other words, we're saying, even though we are poor, we are bound to do 2 things. Create en masse consumption base, fast-tracked movement of goods and services, fast movement of people around. That in itself will turn this continent to something else. Listen to this. It will also, where people don't understand, by 2030, it will create trade growth among the continent at a rate of 33%. Mm-hmm. if it was to be practiced. The question, why doesn't it get implemented? We don't know.
Is there an issue also around, and I'll come back to Advocate Mantula around this, is there an issue at all about the infrastructure that we have on the continent? Here in South Africa, we are now lamenting the dilapidating states of our rail network. Is that an issue at all? Is there a barrier to this free trade that we want, because that free trade also means ease of movement?
Good. First, when they put this paper into print, they pledged with the donors to put $108 billion to help the infrastructure development. 2, each of our member states of all the countries were supposed to make sure that they manage the supply chain systems, because the two go hand in hand. Because one of the reasons why Africa doesn't trade is that it takes somebody here to go to Kenya with goods 14 days because of the borders, because of the poor roads. While at the same distance, in Europe, of the same distance, takes their trucks less than 3 days. So the question is, we need to understand that without speed, a delivery of goods and services, we can move. So you are very right. The infrastructure is one of the key ones. The second one is supply chain, and the third one is the borders. Yeah.
Asanda, thank you for making time for us this evening as well. So the infrastructure is one aspect of it, but there's also an issue around the documentation that is expected. And for instance, if you look at aviation, and we are told how difficult it is to travel on the continent, and it's much easier to travel outside of the continent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the biggest problems that Africa has is definitely infrastructure. And part of that is because we have political systems and political leaders who are not accountable to anybody, and who have sometimes budgets, if they're in a country that follows any tax laws, that they basically use and abuse at will. And so what this does is that it gives you countries that are countries by mere fact that they have people living in them who identify as people of that specific country. But there's very little in terms of the other infrastructure that are required for a country to be, a functioning one. So an example, which unfortunately South Africa is joining the ranks of the rest of the continent, is the ability of the state to provide an unlimited supply or uninterrupted supply of electricity. You have the inability of the state to provide water and an uninterrupted supply of water. And these are basic issues that are seeing us go back into a situation where people are unable to live in the countries that they are born in because they can't even get, access to the basics. And so you can't talk about, the bigger things about why it's impossible to trade within Africa if we can't talk about the basics. And when it comes to documentation, South Africa, for example, has had to bear a lot of the burden of the lack of documentation of Africa, because Gauteng, the last time I read, was one of the provinces which had the highest number of unidentified bodies, because people were migrating and coming into South Africa and often not coming in with the documentation of their country of origin, and sometimes coming in with the documentation of the last country that they were in. And so somebody would be from Cameroon but would be documented as being from Mozambique, which is fine for the purposes of needing to move and whatever purposes they would have done it for, but it becomes very difficult when you have a body that needs to be repatriated. And so we're seeing the impact of the lack of documentation and the lack of infrastructure that makes this documentation valid, and that makes this documentation something that you can actually check against something, right? So for example, even now we know that in South Africa, we suffer from a situation where people are producing documents from across the continent that are not always easy to check, whether you're talking about a passport or a license or even qualifications, months for the qualifications, bodies to be able to kind of check the validity of the documents, because our continent doesn't have a system of documentation. And in fact, South Africa at various stages has had to donate its own capacity to document people. If you remember, in the DRC, South Africa ran a program at some stage where they were giving people identification, because without identification, it becomes difficult to do free movement of goods. It becomes difficult to do free movement of people, and it becomes difficult to monitor whether you're talking migration of people or goods across the different states of Africa.
Okay, thank you so much for that. When we come back, let's have a conversation about the different stakeholders, including the politicians as well as the corporate citizens that we sometimes speak about, and sometimes those corporate citizens coming from foreign countries, including Western countries, and the type of stuff that they do on the continent. Welcome back. As we wrap up Africa Month, we focus on economic integration within the continent itself. And Advocate Mandula, the question that I want to deal now with is in relation to governance. For an Africa Free Trade Area to work, it means that there must be proper governance systems in place. But then you have the US law enforcement agencies that recently announced the whole corruption with Glencore, the $100 million that was paid in bribes to officials in Nigeria, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Equatorial Guinea, Venezuela, the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as Brazil. But if we focus on the African states itself, what should be happening to ensure that these things don't happen and we have the rightful people being able to operate within the continent?
You know, Aldrin, I was just looking at your topic of integration economically, and we have this notion of people-to-people connection, people-to-people contact, governance, corruption index, and if you have even protocols within the AU. Now, I think what has happened in the AU is the organs not able to bite, not to investigate, prosecute. And the issue that you raised earlier of differences of your multinationals, what stakes do they play? You look at your Mozambique. Whenever there's natural resources in Africa, you've got this appetite of multinationals. So the issue, again, you can say that maybe it's the issue of compliance. Is it the issue of undermining the laws within the nation?
Because
look at us now, Aldrin, quickly, South Africa, with the Zondo Commission report. It is loaded with what has happened. But if you look in many African countries, corruption has been normalized.
My issue here with the Glencore saga, for instance, is that here you have a multinational, its coffers run really deep. And when we are trying to push business on the continent, it means that the playing field is not being leveled at all. Because you've got somebody who has got deep pockets who's able to pay an official to make sure that a mining license is signed off, whereas the other guy on the continent is struggling to do that.
Correctly what you are saying. I think Brother Peter will attest that there's gross human rights violations even within the business community. When they're even practicing in Africa, when they come into contact, and the issue of exploitation. And not only that, you know, Aldrin, I'll say to you two things that I've just picked up, Doctor, when you were talking about supply chain, integration and mass. But one of my colleagues at UNISA said that there are two things that in Africa we will be facing. There's a rush for the metal, your platinum, your gold, your mining. There's a rush for the seed. The seed in terms of food security. So we are going to have a problem even of the so-called multinationals with genetically modified food. So as you are thinking of economic onslaught, there is even the issue of GMO, where they are hitting us on the issue of our nutrition. So the seed bank, we don't have a seed bank. President Mbeki used the word of Ahmed Bella, said in Africa, we don't have the blood bank. But I said, Dr. Karunga, we don't have a seed bank in Africa because the seed will be stolen. And the seed is still being stolen even today.
Dr. Karunga, how possible then is economic integration within the continent when we have so much instability and even the wars amongst the militia groups and so forth? Even sometimes you find between the states. Like look at this turmoil now between the DRC as well as Rwanda and the re-emergence of the M23.
Two things, I'll give you points. As an economist, there are fundamental issues that we need to unbundle. First, our politicians are never held to account at all. 3, a majority of our people are so poor, they are so vulnerable to be twisted and vote at least for a small thing like bread basket. 4, therefore corruption is a killer in this continent. 3, we don't understand what skills mean. We need to start training our people in skills. Thanks that Africa is seen as the source of the best analytics and IT young people come 2020, 2030. That's what we are reading in the books. But more important, we as human beings are not trained to hold ourselves to be accountable for us to succeed.
But what about something like the the peer review mechanism?
But let me come to that in a minute, if you don't mind. What I mean is the following. Violence in Africa is taking us behind. I just come from New York about a month ago. I'm in downtown Manhattan in a restaurant with my little girl. A guy is serving me, he's a black American. He hears we are talking, so he says, you guys are from Africa. We said yes. So in Africa? Yeah. Which part of Africa? I said South Africa. He asked me one question. Why do you people hate your women so much? It hurt me to the core. And I said, yeah, he's right. Because all he sees in social media is the element of violence against our women. And therefore, that happens to be one guy. We don't know how many investors and honestly genuine people are saying enough is enough. Now, question, what do we do? One, we all attend to matches. We go there and we coordinate. Let me finish this one. Yeah. Then men are asking a simple question. What should we do to be real in collecting this? The answer is simple. Economically, we are hurting the economies of this continent. But we can also, as men, start at Women of Goodwill, start something called Women Gender Violence Trust Fund. Yeah. We put more money to give these girls every lawyer the world can afford. Number 2, we help the family going forward. Number 4, we make sure these characters are out of the system, whichever way it is, not by death, by the prison. And that will start changing what people perceive about us, because economics is driven by perception.
By perception. Just quickly, Asanda, on that, I was looking at the speech from Nardos Bekela Thomas, who is the new CEO of the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. And one of the issues that she does raise is this gender-based violence and also the lack of representation of women in key decision-making positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think Africa, like the rest of the world, suffers from the problem of patriarchy, wherein there is still this belief that only men are fit to lead and only men have the capacity and the capabilities that are required for leadership. And so we're seeing in the political sphere across the continent that there are fewer women than there are men. Even though the majority populations of most countries are made up of women, they're still represented by men because of patriarchy. And until we start to deal with that, we're not going to go very far in terms of dealing with gender-based violence, because patriarchy and the idea that men should be the authority figure and the leader, that kind of attitude is what makes it easy for a man to hit a woman, for a man to rape a woman, and for a man to do any and whatever he deems to be correct. But you're not going to see African countries tackling this, because their very ministers, their very presidents themselves are accused of gender-based violence against their wives, against their girlfriends, against, their side pieces. And so you're not going to have people who themselves are guilty of these crimes leading the solving of these crimes. And again, one of the biggest issues with Africa continues to be a lack of leadership and a lack of accountability for failure to lead. If you look anywhere on the continent, probably 99% of this continent has seen a coup at some stage or another and continues to see coups. And there hasn't been anything that has been done, and the AU in particular has failed in terms of doing this. And we continue to have leaders who should no longer be leading. And we've been leading for more years than is actually legally allowed in the countries, including countries like Rwanda, which are now kind of, everybody's almost accepted that we have a dictator in Rwanda and it's okay, and that's just how it's going to be.
Interesting that you should mention Rwanda. I'm going to raise that topic when we come back, and speaking about that agreement that Rwanda has with the UK for people who are seeking asylum in the UK, but the processing happens in Rwanda. Why? and some concluding points as we look at integration, economic integration and participation, cooperation within the continent. Advocate Mandula, conflicts on the continent. But for me, the other interesting bit with what Asanda was saying is the lack of holding the member states of the AU accountable when those atrocities have happened, because the only time that we speak about a member state being suspended from the AU is when there is the so-called unconstitutional change of governance. However, though, what about the human rights violations that happen? And we see now what has happened with Yahya Jammeh as well.
No, correctly what you are raising, but I think the issues broadly on human and people's rights, they will have an impact on economic growth, the issues of conflicts, coups that are happening, but again, the drivers of coups are on natural resources as well. And the element that you were raising earlier of the Rwanda-UK deal, let's go back to it again, like we were saying off air. We see a sign of either human trafficking or enslavement. But look at the issue of immigration and the migration that Africans who have been dying in the shores. But I think Kagame is taking a risk of saying, our former colonizer, by the way, is Britain, let's go into this deal. My worry is that those African nationals who are caught up in UK, they are not from Rwanda, by the way. They are from different countries. Yeah. And it's at the end of this month, actually, where they'll have the first batch. So let's wait and see that first batch, Doctor, to see Africans being sold again.
Dr. Karunga, do you think that it could, like for instance, what we've seen with our Minister of Labour here in South Africa arguing that foreign nationals or the undocumented foreign nationals is skewing the labour market? Do you think like such a deal between the UK and Rwanda could lead to something like that?
Fortunately, I would tend to say with respect that even if it were, opportunity cost, in my view, would be, let's do it. Why? We are scared watching, like I said, a lot of people in boats screaming, dying in the ocean. I don't have the solution to that, but we need to give our credit to that. But there is something that we need to unbundle without time. One, when you hear movement of people migrating to South Africa, in the presence of free trade, what happens? Opportunity spread out. Okay. Economic growth spread out. And therefore the people, instead of coming, they will be remaining there. So it's in the interest of South Africa.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I really wanted to squeeze Asanda in as well on that question around how to deal with poverty, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for choosing Unfiltered this evening with me, Aldrin Simpier. See you again next week, Monday, same time, same place, right here on S3.Zins.